So this episode is obesity and weight loss, an update for 2022, the old way versus the new way. And we're going to start with, first, Jen, defining what is BMI, and why do we use that? How is it measured? And kind of some of the implications of BMI.
Sure. So simply put, body mass index, or BMI, the range for when it starts when you're considered obese is greater than 30.
Right.
So that's the number that we use. And it's really just a calculation based on your height and weight. Mm-hmm. So it's your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. That's the actual formula that we use.
Nobody actually calculates that.
Right. There's
a BMI calculator.
That's right.
But that's what it's.
I'm terrible at math, so I'm not even going to attempt that.
It's not a perfect science.
Right. It's not a perfect science. But it's a pretty good indicator, I think, for population health purposes to tell us as a whole, as a society, as a world, where are we at with how...
Directionally, how big are we or how big are we not?
Right. But individually, it can be tricky because your height doesn't change after a certain point in your life, but your weight will always go up and down or can go up and down. And so, for example, you could have, I always think of Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, or Arnold Schwarzenegger back in his heyday when he was super lean and muscular. They were both going to trip the obesity
Morbidly
number.
obese.
But they're very lean. They have a ton of muscle mass.
Yeah.
And, you know, conversely, you could have somebody that has a normal BMI, but from a metabolic state, they're very, very unhealthy.
Might be 30, 40% body fat.
So it is a metric. It is one that we start with. It's not the end-all, be-all, but it tells you, at least on the spectrum, of where you fall from your height and weight and potentially your risk for developing chronic diseases based on that.
I think it's a useful because it's easy. It's a standardized deal. It's very useful for population health. And directionally, it can be correlative to health or lack of. But anything more than raising the red flag to double check whether it's accurate, it really has limited use beyond the things I just mentioned. And our observation is that it becomes more and more reliable of a lack of health indicator the bigger it is.
Right.
So like if you had 1,000 people with a BMI of 45, nobody in there is going to be healthy. So at some point, it's pretty clear, and then directionally it can tell you if you're mapping in the right direction. But we also see on the other end of the spectrum kind of an inverse, not an inverse, but an inconsistency where when your BMI drops below, say, 30, you're going to capture a fair number of very, very fit, especially men, who are measuring as overweight or even obese, who are just profoundly muscular and otherwise metabolically pristine. So we tend to say as the BMI gets lower, it becomes more and more unreliable as a singular metric. And again, back to your point, because of the way that it's measured, it's height over weight. Weight over height. The only thing that can change in that equation is the numerator on the top. And so if weight goes up, even if it's 10 pounds of muscle, your BMI goes down. So I think it's important to point that out. The other thing, back to the bigger the BMI, the reason we're interested in BMIs as they go higher as a classification for the term obesity is that obesity is a real red flag for the thing that you and I talk probably the most about, which is metabolic disease and metabolic syndrome. Right? Remind listeners, what is metabolic disease as we define it?
Well, typically they are diseases of an energy dysregulation. And we've done a whole podcast on this. So I encourage the listeners to go back and listen to that.
And we'll link to some of these other episodes in our blog and our show notes.
But they're referring to really an excess energy state. So more calorie intake, more food intake, less activity, The quality of the food is down, so therefore you're just packing on fat onto your body. But metabolic syndrome typically, I mean, it is a diagnosis. We use it as an ICD-10 code, but you have to have 3 or more of the following, which is...
and these are real criteria.
These are real criteria. A waistline of 40 inches or greater for men, 35 inches or greater for women, along with high blood pressure, elevated fasting blood sugar, and dyslipidemia, which we define as a low HDL cholesterol or increased triglycerides.
Right. So that's 5 total criteria in order to have metabolic syndrome.
You have to have 3 or more.
3 or more. And what we know, and is rarely talked about, and we've talked about a bunch in our content, is that the root physiology behind metabolic syndrome is insulin resistance. And so it's almost like saying diabetes is a late finding.
Yeah.
You
know, don't wake up and
no.
become diabetic.
No, this is something that's been going on in most cases 8, 10, 12, 15 years at some point. But, you know, for one reason or another, it was overlooked, not looked for, or undealt with. But it does have consequences. So the significance of metabolic disease, I think, is really... You know, Dr. Wenzel, why does being overweight or obese matter? Here it is on a bumper sticker. It absolutely puts you at a higher risk for metabolic syndrome and other metabolic diseases, which fuel the flames of several of the top killers of human beings, being diabetes, heart disease, cancer, dementia.
Yep.
These are absolute lighter fluid physiology changes to these incredibly significant killers of humans. So it's not just about being fat or being obese or having a BMI of whatever number. Like, whatever it takes to initiate the conversation to deal with the underlying risks that are being absorbed because you're carrying excess fat on your frame, whatever it takes to create the room for that conversation, it absolutely is the health issue of humanity on the planet. No disease will outpace diabetes worldwide in the next 20 years.
That's so
Not
scary.
one.
Yeah.
And diabetes, the inability to regulate one's blood sugar due to being resistant to insulin, is the singular gateway physiology to 70% of the top killers of humans. Like, it's the thing. We could get everything else right. If we miss this, we are not going to make a significant impact in the health and well-being as a species. And there are some scary pediatric obesity, insulin-resistant pediatric diabetic cases on the horizon, especially in some of our poorer states, tend to be southern. Really some scary stuff. This is like red lights and sirens.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the significance of it.